Hi all, Dr. Reynolds again. Before we move too far forward in the class, I'd like to take a minute to look back. And of course, we began our class with a number of readings that were supposed to provide you with some context and some history to the field of computers and writing, and some of the big issues and concepts that we'll be talking about throughout the semester. So here I'm just going to go over a couple of the readings that I think are kind of the core readings of our first 3 weeks of class, and make sure you got the big ideas. And obviously, after you watch this, if you want to discuss some of these ideas, please get in contact, right? Post that information in the discussion board for weeks 2 to 3 in the discussion of readings, or in the off-topic conversations, or just shoot me an email, right? We can have these conversations. So here we go. The readings we're going to talk about today are Knievel's What's Humanistic About Computers and Writing, Historical Patterns and Contemporary Possibilities for the Field. Charles Moran's Computers and Composition, 1983 to 2002, What We Have Hoped For. Joseph Moxley's Datagogies, Writing Spaces and the Age of Peer Production. And Stuart Selber's Multiliteracies for a Digital Age. So looking at Knievel's article, what is humanistic about computers and writing? Obviously, what he did to write this article is to look back at the articles that were published during the time and try to find similar themes in those articles to be able to classify them. And this is kind of, if you're an academic, you recognize this kind of work, but this is kind of work that leads to a literature review. So you might think about this kind of article as one approach you could take to a research paper for this class, and something you could publish then in the future. And that would be to take a historical view of a field and try to understand what are the conversations that are happening and how can we trace them through different periods and transitional periods within that field. So a couple of things happen that are interesting here, right? So Knievel makes a point of defining computers and writing as a subfield of rhetoric and composition. So rhetoric is that study of the means of persuasion or effective communication. Composition, the study of writing studies, right? So teaching writing. And he makes a point of defining rhetoric and composition as something that is often understood, perhaps misunderstood, as English humanities as literature, right? So rhetoric and composition as a field of English studies has made a huge point of trying to separate itself from literature. Literature as the dominant voice in English studies, and rhetoric and composition as a separating and important field, right? So historically there has been a move away from having just any English professor teach writing courses, whereas historically that would have been what happened, right? So typically freshman composition courses were taught by literature professors who use it as a way to validate their position, right? So you have to teach enough students in those freshman service classes in order to have time to research, write about, and teach the classes you really cared about, which were literature classes. Composition, rhetoric and composition as a field basically said, wait a minute, what we do is important and valuable, and you should have specialists in that field teaching those classes. And so, but it's still a field within the big umbrella of English humanities, right? And humanism is basically a philosophical stance that emphasizes and values the value and agency of human beings individually and collectively. And it puts kind of what it means to be human at the center of the discourse in whatever field you employ it in, right? So it's a particular philosophical perspective that drives this work. That is part of what drives the idea of the humanities in general, right? Studying and understanding what it means to be human, to act human, how we treat each other, all these things, okay? What's really interesting here is that Knievel identifies what he calls 4 meaningful intersections of computers and writing and the humanities that are complicated by kind of new technologies and the ideas of post-modernity. So traditional ideas about what it means to be a writer and what writing looks like have been complicated theoretically because of postmodernism and deconstruction and other post-humanism moves in this way, but they persist. And computers and other digital technologies also complicate these perspectives on writing and what it means to be a writer. And so Knievel makes the connection between changes in the theories that are driving work in the humanities with kind of the influence of technology, okay? So you can think about something as simple as consumption, which of course is complicated by production, right? If literature professors are all about consumption, right, having you read books, but consume ideas, right? The idea of education is something that fills you up, right? Consumption. And the writing teacher is more about students actually doing the writing in class, doing the work in the class. Then there's a shift between consumption and production. Of course, you're doing both in a typical English class. But there's the privilege breaks down, right? The binary begins to break down. And if you think about Web 2.0, where users of the web can respond freely, think about social media, for example. In Facebook, you make a post, people can respond to you, you can respond to them, you can like their things, love their things, care for their things. This is bringing production into what has traditionally been a news outlet that is about you consuming the news, right? Similarly, art authorship, traditionally, 18th century ideas about authorship that continue to dominate is this idea of the single authored paper, the kind of tortured genius who produces this complete text on his or her own. And that is complicated by the idea of collaboration, right? And collaboratively speaking, you've probably been in classrooms where you are forced to do teamwork, group work, right? And that kind of collaboration runs counter to our persistent ideas about what it means to be an author. Even as there are plenty of fields where collaboration has become the norm. In English studies, that is not the case, right? Most articles we'll read have one or two authors. When they have more, it's usually because it's from another field that relates and I bring it in. You think about the idea of the text changing as well. So the idea of the permanent text, right? This is the version of the text that's going to last. And kind of the idea of the permanence of a text is made clear by its physical production, right? As a bound collection of paper, as a book, right? There's something permanent feeling about a book, about any kind of artifact like that is a physical product. That is very different from thinking about a computer program, right, which might be updated continually. So if you played any online games, you might see that there are regularly updates to those games, and you get version 1.1.3, version 1.1.4, etc., etc. So the core production doesn't change, but it's not permanent, right? There are constantly evolutions and improvements made to it. So in this way, the permanence, the kind of perceived permanence of a written book is transformed into this continual process through which things that are digital, because it's so easy to change them, so easy to update them, are no longer permanent but are constantly in process. It also gives you this idea of performance, right? So traditionally speaking, we're talking about research, published research in English studies. You're talking about journal articles, right? You're talking about books. In the case of conferences, there is an aspect of performance, but that performance is documented in a conference proceedings, perhaps, right? There is preference given to that permanent product. Online, you can have continual performance because things like vlogs, video, weblogs, right, or just videos, when you think about them on YouTube, are continually loaded so that every time you watch it, it's a performance, and that performance is something you can interact with because you can post comments, they can interact back with you, posting other comments. And YouTubers who are successful are oftentimes crafting new videos continually that are continuing that performance of their channel, which might be thought of as a book with a whole bunch of different videos or a whole bunch of different chapters, right? So in this way, computers force us to change the ways we think about texts, change the ways we think about authors, change the way we think about audiences, right? More than just consumers, but also producers and participants, right? And there's one more key thing that he brings out, and it's the idea of ethics. And ethics are key to humanities because humanities as we talk about humanism as a philosophical perspective, it's oftentimes secular humanism, which means that rather than look to God for guidance for morals and ethics, they argue that you can look within your human society, within your relationship to other humans, think about the ways in which we value humanity, and that's what drives ethics. But those ethics become canonical. They become identified with what we call the great works, right? So in the humanities, there's kind of a great books approach to the humanities that says these are the important thinkers you need to read, and by reading all these important ideas, those ideas will come to shape you as a human who will interact ethically in our human society. This, of course, has changed tremendously as we recognize that not all canons represent all people. Right? If you think about canons in American literature, for example, you would have seen them 20 years ago dominated by white men. And increasingly we see more and more women first, and then more and more African American voices, and now the inclusion of Hispanic, Latinx voices, the inclusion of Native or First Peoples voices. So as identity becomes less shared and less hegemonic, what we have instead is thinking about what is the identity of smaller groups and of individuals within those groups, and how does that relate to ethics. So this shift away from kind of a group and communal idea that everybody is kind of the same, we're all humans, to this idea of we're all humans and but we're individuals within our humanity, and that means that we're all slightly different or significantly different in different ways, and that's what drives ethics. And so there's this complication of these ideas that he finds mirrored in both kind of postmodern approaches to English studies and in new technologies. So he traces the history of what he calls the humanistic argument about computers and writing by looking at that the extant work, right? So he looks from 1975 to 1992, and he calls that time fear and loathing. Then he goes moving the social turn online, 1990 to 2000. And then he goes phase 3, which is what he kind of calls the current situation, right? So originally there's a lot of kind of fear about computers because they're not understood as humanistic tools in the 1970s, right? Their tools are used for science and math. But computers and writing has a reason to try to look at them as humanistic because they want the humanities to be valued in a society where computers are valued, right? But there are a lot of reactions against ethical concerns that computers will diminish creativity, writerly control, and audience response, right? That's that idea of loathing, right? Things we don't like about it, right? Ultimately, he says that people this time argue that the goal of computers and writing overlap with the field of composition rhetoric, so the computer-based writing environment should be informed by that theory and pedagogy. In other words, maybe we don't have something to say about all of computers, right? But there's an aspect of computers and the ways in which computers are coming into our lives that we should have some control and some say in. And that should be the ways in which computer-based writing is happening, where it's happening online, who's designing those programs, and how they're implemented in education, right? 1990 to 2000, we see it follows a switch in composition theory. So I've attached Bruffy's article on collaboration, and it's very much what we call the social turn in composition studies, and that's that moment in composition studies where collaboration kind of takes hold, and it kind of still has hold of the kind of work we do in classrooms, right? We start to not only recognize that many people work on many texts before they become public, but that is a valuable thing, that working together with diverse groups of people can actually improve the product of what you're doing, okay? So he says this period is informed both by the collaborative and social theories of composition studies and the growth of networks and hypertext and the web, all of which kind of make connections between people and make collaboration a more evident part of the work we do, okay? He says they envision writing space as student-centered and multivocal, right, many voices, spaces that might manifest a new way of thinking about knowledge, text, and authorship, right? Exactly those crossroads that he identified before, right? He defines hypertext as unstable, multivocal, and contextual, and carries that over really to we can start thinking about text differently, right? Texts have always been subject to change, right? There have been new additions to things. They've always been multivocal, right? Even when we're quoting from different people and pulling into our own work, those are many voices encompassed in one. And contextual, right? Everything we do and work on changes based on the context in which we are. Finally, it leads to critique of technology as it relates to human others, right? So in the 90s and 2000s, people really are paying attention to what it means to be outside of the dominant subject of society, right? So what does it mean to be a non-white person in America? What does it mean to be what does it mean to not identify as male, or to not identify as heterosexual, right? All of these ways in which we push them away from the norm by identifying them as different, or they push themselves away from the norm or embrace that by identifying themselves as different. We see that critique happening because more voices have more access through education and through technology during this period. Phase 3 is kind of where he says the work is from 2000 to about 2009 when this is published, right? So he sees a shift beyond purely humanistic concerns to postmodern and post-human concerns, including more critical approaches to multimedia, multimodal, and multivocal texts. So multi, right? And that goes along with multiliteracies we read. Right, multimedia, working with lots of different mediums, right, simultaneously. Multimodal, actually constructing through different means than we have traditionally done, and sometimes multiple means. And multivocal, including different voices and kind of valuing diversity. Number 2, online identity and subjectivity, right? The role of the subject, the role of the other, and the ways in which that changes or creates our different ethics and ethos. And civil engagement, which is now we're moving towards, so what do we do with all this otherness, and how do we fix these problems we've identified? Well, it comes through civic engagement, right? Interaction, something else we'll talk about as we move through the semester. It adopts notions of digital literacy, expanding the focus of computers and writing beyond critical consumption to critical production through Web 2.0 technologies, right? Uses Selber's work, which I'll discuss later, to suggest the remnants of humanism in this era, redefining humanism in computers and writing as requiring, quote, literacies of both consumption, critical and rhetorical, right, and production, functional and rhetorical, right? In other words, similar ideas to what Selber was talking about, just more slightly. Selber is representative of this period, right? And so, of course, those ideas are there. This work moves toward a 21st century notion of the humanities in which human subjectivity identity is destabilized. Text includes non-print forms and genres. Knowledge is always already under constant revision, and a fully equipped writer must be equally capable of analysis and reproduction for multi-mediated participation in the academy, the workplace, in both personal and public spheres. And this is something we all have been recognizing in our discussion posts. And that is that whether we want to join this new way of thinking, this new way of working or not, we kind of have to, right? Because our workplace and the ways in which we interact with each other have changed, right? Okay, that brings me to Charles Moran's piece, Computers and Composition, 1983 to 2002, What We Have Hoped For, which is even more focused historical piece, and that it looks just back at what was published in Computers and Composition, which is kind of the dominant, the top journal for the field of computers and writing. And so he looks from 1983 to 2002 and kind of says, what were people saying, right? And how could he code that together? So he reviews the first 20 years of the leading periodical, examining the hopes that writing classroom technologies will improve teaching and learning of writing, the status of writing teachers in the academy and beyond, and create a more egalitarian and just society, right? So he argues that much of the early work in the field seems naive in hindsight, but the work's important because it comes from dedicated teachers working with students, right? And more importantly, he says these hopes, even if our work actually falls short of achieving those hopes, it continues to drive important work and research in the field. All right, so we can strive towards the, quote, world we have always wanted, right? So he kind of says these are the things that we as a field have hoped for. So researchers who have published are generally upbeat, optimistic, enthusiastic, and forward-looking about technology and writing, even when it's published alongside and in spite of articles about the failure of particular technology pedagogies, right? So this idea like, this is going to do this, and it's going to be great, it's all going to work, even when you actually put it into practice, there are stumbling blocks and problems in enacting that. But it's almost like the researchers never lose that optimism, even though they stumble along the way, right? So this approach toward technology and teaching is likely a result of, quote, the dominant discourse of technology, which is uncritically positive, right? Technology is progress, progress is good, that kind of idea. The profession of teaching is also full of positiveness, right? We're always hopeful about the potential for positive change. To be a teacher, you have to believe students can get better and get smarter and be more, right? You have to believe that's possible. It's a hopeful outlook. And of course, American culture that tends to be solution-based, right? And one thing that Americans over time have prided themselves on is they have achieved more, progressed further. The American dream, right, means that no matter where you come from, you can get ahead in this life. He also observes two persistent hopes that drive the field. One a concurrent hope and one a more recent hope that he organizes kind of his arguments around those hopes. So those continued hopes are here, right? So computers will eliminate the drudgery of writing and teaching of writing. So for a long time, this kind of persistent hope is that computers will make our lives easier, make teaching better, and writing better. So he defines kind of the drudgery of writing as copy editing, revising, and retyping. Now think about, there are certainly programs that do so much better at copy editing and helping you to revise than ever before, but they don't really get you all the way to real revision, right? We still kind of need that human eye. And maybe I'll share this semester some studies of where people have tried to beat computerized graders, for example. There's a drudgery of teaching, though. Also, it takes a lot of work to respond to student writing and do so well. And so there definitely are mixed results in this area so far, but it's something that continued research is constantly happening, right? How can we use technology to make the work we do easier? At least we don't have to keep retyping, rewriting things like you would have before. If you've ever had to work on a typewriter, you could make a mistake. And if your mistake was too big to be able to white out and squeeze in, you basically had to retype that entire page, or more if it pushed you, way over the next page. So, number two, the computerized word processors will improve student writing. Now, if you've taught an English class or any class in which writing is part of that, you know that student writing has not gotten significantly better since computers have come around. In fact, results of some of these studies suggest that computers may actually hinder writing. They make writing easier, but make it worse, and/or that computers have no effect whatsoever on writing. So it is my own perspective, based on my personal experience as anecdotal, that computers haven't really had an impact on the quality of student writing. That it makes it easier to do some work with your writing, but that overall the quality of student writing has stayed about the same in my 20 years of educational experience. Number three, so those are your two kind of concurrent, carryover things. And then there's two more recent things he says. Adopting technology will improve the marginalized situation of writing instructors. In other words, that if we can become an established, secure field based on research, scholarship, tenure, and promotion as teachers of information literacy, we might have more power in academia and in society. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with English studies, but it is not one of the higher paid fields in higher education. It is not particularly respected when there's a big push for STEM education, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math education. It's kind of like where does English fall? And so English becomes a series of service courses, and when you teach a lot of service courses like freshman composition, introduction to literature, or technical writing, you're in the service of what might be perceived as more important fields, right? So basically, he says there's a hope in some of this discipline literature that if we could become information literacy experts rather than just writing experts or literacy experts, then maybe we could become less marginalized in academia, become more important and more central to the education that is valued by the United States. And number four, looking through rather than at technology will lead to a quiet revolution through our teaching to a better, more egalitarian and peaceful world. Right? So this is that idea of critical pedagogy, of civic engagement, that even while a lot of our research remains uncritical, we are really good at being critical of other things. And so there's this persistent hope that by doing this work, right, we can actually improve society. Joseph Moxley, his Datagogies, Writing Spaces in the Age of Peer Production, deals with a different aspect of computers and writing, and that is in that it kind of hones down and centers on this positive understanding of peer production, of working together, collaboration, these ideas that have become really key to composition studies and really central to the work we do with computers, right? We're all interested in the cloud and the network, and all these things are ways in which connectivity is emphasized. And so a datagogy, which is not a term that's really caught on, but the concept has certainly caught on, is this idea of Moxley's to be able to theorize and describe what happens when groups of teachers use technology to build and share theory and pedagogy about the teaching of writing, right? He argues that datagogies engage the critical power of individuals working together collaboratively in a climate that respects diversity and independent thinking. In other words, a datagogy is a collaborative effort, and that collaborative effort is made possible and emphasized through computer technologies. Okay, so he further argues that such datagogies are necessary in order to maintain the relevance of English studies. So very much like Moran's article found, there's this idea that we can actually be more impactful by working together and understanding and using technology. Okay, but kind of his key ideas that really carry through in contemporary work in computers and writing is this idea of the wisdom of the crowds. So the wisdom of the crowds is about commons-based peer-to-peer technologies. So think about wiki technologies. But they may apply to other quote-unquote new communication technologies like social networking, which was just kind of starting to blossom when he's doing this work. So the technologies seem to challenge traditional assumptions about authorship, authority, collaboration, and power, right? So that we've talked about in those other articles. And quote, these popular writing sites provide models of new learning environments that enable writers to reach broad audiences for their texts, providing a world stage for collaboration, dialogue, conflict, and innovation. In other words, we have now writing spaces where writing is happening, not just by students, but by citizens, right? Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, right? So where messages are going out there and there are real audiences responding back. So in brief, he says our society has moved from the information age to the age of peer production, right? So what he's interested in is how this wisdom of the crowd is beneficial to society and destabilizes what we've thought of as authorship and authority in the past, right? So no longer are small groups of people making information for everybody, right, like news sources, but instead lots of individuals are making lots of different reports, and it's all coming together. And he says there's wisdom in that, right? So he kind of creates these two different ideas about communities, one being traditional and individual, and the other being new, based on the crowd, right? So he calls them the community of power and the community of learning. And the community of power, he says, is driven by competition, individualism, and capital success. In that kind of relationship, the instructor is the ultimate power in a classroom. Collaboration only happens then in controlled context, right? So you might use collaboration in your classroom to have your students work on group work, but if you're not really destabilizing your own power in the classroom, in kind of the way you phrase everything, you're still within that community of power, right? It's community of power allowing this activity to happen. And he says ultimately it fails to engage students. The community of learning, on the other hand, this is what he's arguing for. He says this is new, and instead of being based around the individual, it's based around the crowd, right? We're all working together, we're all in this together. It's driven by the search and sharing of knowledge and understanding, cooperation, and openness. In other words, it doesn't matter if it's my individual idea, if it's your individual idea, if it's an idea we've all worked out together. Think about the Creative Commons. Creative Commons is a copywriting system that allows your information to be open and free and shared. And that we would learn more, we could do more, right? He says it's process-based rather than product-based, right? It's built around social epistemology, which is the idea that we learn by interacting with one another rather than learn by turning internally or burying ourselves in individual research. He calls this kind of feeling that goes around it that engages students wiki love. So whether you buy that or not, that's his argument, right? And that idea of peer production is certainly central to Web 2.0. In the last 2 weeks, you read from Stuart Stelber's Multiliteracies for a Digital Age. I'm not going to really dig into it because there's a whole lecture about it from last time. But basically, I just want to go over the key points. So he argues that new technologies do not simply change literacy, but require new literacies. So students must be taught to be multiliterate, not only in terms of reading and writing different and new texts, but also in terms of occupying multiple subject positions and working toward multiple objectives as they encounter and create traditional and new media texts. He argues for a fusing of functional, critical, and rhetorical literacies, and he places composition teachers at the center of teaching such multiliteracies. This idea, right, that if we don't kind of make claim of computers' relationship to writing, then we'll lose control of that, and we'll ultimately lose control of writing. And as experts in the field, that's kind of what we're supposed to be doing. So here's a quick review, right? So he sets out to reclaim the English discipline's place at the forefront of digital literacy study and education. He seeks to release the concept of computer literacy from the actual tools and hardware that currently bind it to a hands-on workshops and the laborious tutorial documentation. In other words, more than functional literacy, right? He reestablishes digital literacy as multiliteracy, wherein the conversation can open up beyond the computer lab and connections can begin to be established across formats, functions, documents, and disciplines. And of course, he establishes his 3 separate areas of digital literacy: functional, critical, and rhetorical literacies. So he assumes that computer literacy starts with functional literacy, right, which is a rudimentary acquisition of skills and utilization of various tools. In other words, you can use the machine to do something, right? He calls for critical literacy amongst both students and teachers, right, to ask questions about, like, why are we using this technology? How is this technology benefiting or harming us, right, to better understand the technologies that you've learned to use, right? Then engages students in rhetorical literacy and increased understanding and perception of social and cultural climates and changes by issuing a call for faculty to help students evaluate technology in rhetorical contexts and then reevaluate and even reproduce that technology in productive and positive ways. Ultimately, he hopes that students will be able to will be masters of these multiliteracies, right? And can move on from just being functionally adept computer users to becoming fully aware, fully critical interface designers, right? So that that students can actually be part of, and teachers can actually be part of creating the technologies that we're using rather than just being consumers, right? So we go back to this idea of that complication of consumers and producers. And so those are the big ideas that we'll be dealing with from the history side of things. We've moved into blogs. This time we're moving into wikis even more so. And so these are the kinds of new texts and new technologies that show these theoretical perspectives actually in use in our society, not just with students, not just in research, but actually in the real world, where writers and readers are using them every day. And so keep sticking with it, and as always, if you have questions, send me an email. I am here to help. I love to continue these conversations. Thanks.